There is a question surrounding the Lindsay Clancy case that has become almost impossible to ignore. If Patrick Clancy knew how badly his wife was struggling, could he have done more to protect her and their children? That question has drawn enormous attention. People have looked at his work schedule, his involvement in Lindsay's treatment, the time he spent away from home, and even rumors about problems inside the marriage. But there is something very important about that line of questioning that can easily get lost. According to the defense attorney and criminologist interviewed in the source material, putting too much blame on Patrick could actually hurt the very defense Lindsay's lawyers are trying to build. And if you're just joining us, welcome. I'm glad you're here. Please subscribe to the channel so you can stay with us as we follow the latest developments in this case. Now, let's get back to the question that has so many people asking, what really happened? And that is where this case becomes much more complicated than simply asking whether Lindsay Clancy should be held responsible for the deaths of her 3 children. The central issue is whether she understood what she was doing at the time, or whether she was experiencing postpartum psychosis and was, as the defense argues, not criminally responsible for her actions. Before getting into the legal argument, though, it is important to go back to what the jury has heard about Lindsay's mental health. Her husband, Patrick Clancy, was one of the state's first witnesses, and his testimony gave the court a glimpse into problems that had been developing long before the January 2023 tragedy. Patrick testified that Lindsay had struggled after the birth of their children. She had sought therapy for a period of time and had told him about intrusive thoughts. According to his testimony, those thoughts involved harming the children or imagining that something might happen to them. Her condition became more difficult after the birth of their 3rd child, Kaylin. She had trouble with the idea of returning to work. She sought psychiatric treatment. She went to a hospital. She also received care from postpartum specialists, and over time, she was prescribed multiple medications. Those details matter because the defense is not presenting Lindsay's mental health crisis as something that suddenly appeared on the day of the killings. The argument is that there had been a history of psychiatric problems, treatment, medication, and increasingly serious symptoms. But there is another detail that makes Patrick's testimony particularly difficult to hear. According to the source transcript, Patrick said that on the day the children died, Lindsay did not tell him that the children were in danger. She did not tell him that she needed immediate help. She did not tell him that she felt overwhelmed. At one point, she asked him to run an errand. He left, and while he was gone, the tragedy occurred. That single decision to leave the house has become one of the things people have seized upon when discussing Patrick. Could he have recognized what was happening? Should he have understood how serious Lindsay's condition had become? Should he have done more to get her psychiatric help? Those are understandable questions, but they are not necessarily the same questions the jury has to answer. That distinction became especially important when Dr. Casey Jordan, a criminologist and defense attorney, discussed the case. Jordan described Patrick as what she considered an easy person for people to blame if they accept the defense's basic argument that Lindsay was experiencing severe psychosis. Her reasoning was straightforward. If people become convinced that Lindsay was not in her right mind when the children died, there can still be a powerful need to hold someone responsible. The tragedy is so enormous that people naturally want someone to answer for it. And Patrick is there. He was the husband. He was the father. He knew she had been struggling. He was the person who left the house that day. But Jordan said she had not seen or heard evidence that made Patrick blameworthy. She pointed out that he was working full-time, trusted his wife, and believed that she would tell him if she needed help. He was not a medical professional, and according to the discussion, he had never even heard of psychosis before this happened. That is a crucial piece of context. Patrick was not sitting at home with a medical textbook explaining the warning signs of postpartum psychosis. He was a husband trying to support his wife while also working and caring for his family. And when Lindsay received inpatient care and was released after a short period, he had reason to trust the medical professionals who had evaluated her. That brings us to the question that may be even more important than what Patrick did. What did the medical system know? Because according to the testimony and discussion in the source material, Lindsay had been seeking help for years. She had reported serious symptoms. She had seen doctors. She had taken multiple medications. And yet, the defense is arguing that the treatment she received may not have been enough. One of the most striking details discussed was the number of medications involved. The defense attorney had reportedly raised questions about why police records initially reflected 7 medications, while additional medications were later found in connection with the civil case. The discussion described the number eventually increasing from 7 to 14. That does not by itself prove that medication caused Lindsay's actions, but it raises a question about how closely her treatment was being monitored and whether the different healthcare providers fully understood what she was taking. And there was another issue. Some of Lindsay's psychiatric care had reportedly been conducted through telehealth. Dr. Jordan argued that this could make it harder for a doctor to recognize physical and behavioral signs of serious deterioration. A doctor speaking with someone through a screen may hear what the patient says, but may miss small details that can be visible during an in-person appointment. The way someone moves, the condition of their clothing, their physical appearance, their ability to care for themselves. Those observations can sometimes provide information that a short appointment over a screen cannot. So now the case is beginning to divide into 2 very different questions. One question is deeply emotional. How could anyone leave a mother who was struggling so badly alone with 3 children? The other is legal and medical. Was Lindsay Clancy experiencing a state of psychosis so severe that she could not understand the wrongfulness of what she was doing? And there is a reason those questions cannot simply be blended together. Because if the defense is able to persuade the jury that Lindsay was experiencing postpartum psychosis, evidence suggesting that she had a separate motive to hurt her children could become extremely damaging to that defense. That is why the focus on Patrick may carry a risk the public does not immediately see. If there really were serious problems in the marriage, investigators and prosecutors would certainly have reason to examine them. But if those problems were presented as a motive for the killings, the defense could face a very different problem. And that is where the question of Patrick Clancy becomes much more complicated than simply asking whether he should have done more. There is one hypothetical that makes the Patrick Clancy question even more important. What if there really had been serious trouble inside the marriage? What if Lindsay had discovered that Patrick was having an affair? And what if prosecutors were able to connect that discovery to what happened inside the Clancy home? According to Dr. Casey Jordan's analysis in the source material, that could create a major problem for the defense. Not because marital problems would automatically make Patrick responsible for what happened. They would not. The issue is motive. If Lindsay had discovered an affair and then deliberately killed her children as a way of hurting Patrick, that would point toward a very different explanation for her actions. It could give prosecutors an argument that the killings were motivated by anger, retaliation, or revenge, rather than by psychosis. And that distinction could be critical. The defense is asking the jury to believe that Lindsay was experiencing a severe psychiatric episode when the children died. But if prosecutors could establish that she had discovered something that made her angry at Patrick and then acted deliberately because of it, that could undermine the argument that she lacked the capacity to understand what she was doing. There is an important caution here. The discussion did not establish that Patrick had an affair. In fact, the experts specifically acknowledged that there was no evidence of an affair and said that, in the absence of evidence, she would assume there was no affair. That is important because rumors can take on a life of their own. particularly in a case involving the deaths of 3 children. Patrick later moved to New York and remarried a doctor who specializes in fertility treatment. The source material also mentions an unconfirmed rumor that he had a child. But none of that establishes that he was unfaithful to Lindsay before the tragedy. And the fact that someone eventually rebuilds his life after an unimaginable loss does not tell us what happened inside a marriage before that loss. People grieve differently. Some remain alone. Some return to work. Some move closer to family. Some eventually form new relationships. There is no universal timetable for grief. That is why the expert pushed back against the idea that Patrick's later life should automatically be treated as evidence of something suspicious. But the hypothetical still matters, because it shows just how much the defense depends on the explanation for Lindsay's state of mind. If the prosecution can establish a conventional motive, the jury could interpret the same actions very differently. And that brings us back to the evidence about Lindsay's mental health. The defense's argument did not begin with the events of one afternoon. According to the testimony discussed in the source material, Lindsay had struggled for years. She had experienced what Patrick described as intrusive thoughts. She had sought treatment. She had experienced changes in her behavior. She had been prescribed multiple psychiatric medications. She had been hospitalized. And after the birth of her 3rd child, the situation became increasingly serious. The defense is attempting to place all of those details into one larger picture. But there is an uncomfortable question for the defense as well. If Lindsay was struggling so severely, why did the people around her not recognize just how dangerous the situation had become? That question puts Patrick back into the center of the discussion. But it also puts the doctors there. It puts the healthcare system there. It puts the medication management there. And it puts Lindsay's own medical history there. Dr. Jordan's argument was that Patrick may have been trusting the professionals who were supposed to understand what was happening. That is significant because the source material describes a situation in which different healthcare providers may not have had a complete picture of Lindsay's medications. The defense had reportedly found additional medication information through the civil case, raising questions about how many medications Lindsay was taking and how carefully those medications were being monitored. The source discussion described medications being found in different places, including a nightstand, a vehicle, and elsewhere around the house. Again, that does not establish that medication caused the killings. But it does give the defense something concrete to examine. Were the medications being changed too quickly? Were doctors communicating with each other? Was anyone carefully tracking what Lindsay was taking? Was her nursing background causing doctors to assume that she understood her own medications better than she actually did? Those questions could become important when expert witnesses eventually explain the defense's theory to the jury. And there is another part of this case that makes the legal question particularly difficult. Massachusetts does not use exactly the same terminology for an insanity defense that many other states use. The term discussed in the source material is not criminally responsible. Dr. Jordan explained that Massachusetts uses a substantial capacity approach rather than treating insanity as a simple yes or no question. In other words, the issue can involve whether a person, because of a disease of the mind or defect of reason, was unable to appreciate or understand the wrongfulness of the act at the time it occurred. That distinction matters. A person can appear completely different later. Someone can be deeply remorseful after an episode. Someone can understand the horror of what happened after the episode has passed. But the legal question focuses on the person's mental state at the time of the alleged crime. That is why Lindsay's current appearance may not answer the question by itself. She can sit in court, crying. She can appear to understand what happened. She can appear devastated. But if the defense's theory is correct, none of that necessarily tells the jury what her mind was capable of understanding on the day the children died. And according to Dr. Jordan, that is one reason Lindsay testifying could become so important. She argued that if Lindsay's account of psychosis is genuine, there may be things she can describe that no doctor can fully recreate for the jury. She could potentially explain what she was experiencing, what she believed, what she heard, and why she believed she had to act at that particular moment. That last detail is especially significant because Patrick testified about a later conversation in which Lindsay reportedly said she heard a man's voice telling her that if she did not do it then, she would lose her chance. That statement could become central to the defense's explanation of what was happening inside her mind. But it also creates a difficult credibility question. Does the jury believe that account? Do they believe Lindsay was genuinely experiencing psychosis? Or do they believe that she understood what she was doing and is now explaining the events through the language of mental illness? That may ultimately become one of the most important questions in the entire case. And it is also why the argument over Patrick is so delicate. If people focus on whether Patrick was a perfect husband, they may be asking a question that the jury does not actually have to answer. He did not have to be a perfect husband for Lindsay to have been psychotic. He did not have to make every correct medical decision for the defense to succeed. And he did not have to understand postpartum psychosis for Lindsay's mental state to be genuine. At the same time, if evidence eventually showed that Patrick knowingly ignored an obvious and immediate danger, that would be a separate matter that deserves careful examination. But based on the material discussed here, the expert's position was that there was not evidence establishing that Patrick was blameworthy. And that leaves the case resting on a much harder question, not whether Patrick could have been a better husband, not whether Lindsay had a difficult marriage, but whether, in the moments when the children died, Lindsay understood the wrongfulness of what she was doing. Because if the defense can persuade the jury that she did not, the consequences could be very different from a murder conviction. And that is where the next stage of this case becomes especially important. What the jury hears about the law, the medical evidence, and what could happen to Lindsay if the court accepts the defense's argument. The question now becomes, what happens if the jury accepts Lindsay Clancy's explanation? Because a finding of not criminally responsible does not simply mean that a defendant walks out of the courtroom and goes home. According to the legal explanation in the source material, Massachusetts treats this differently from an ordinary acquittal. A person found not criminally responsible can be committed for psychiatric treatment, with the goal of addressing the condition that led to the offense. The length of that commitment can depend on the person's mental condition and the judgment of the professionals responsible for evaluating whether the person remains dangerous. That distinction is important because many people hear the words "not guilty" and immediately assume that the person is simply free. The situation can be much more complicated. Dr. Jordan explained that someone found not criminally responsible could remain in psychiatric care until experts determine that the person has recovered sufficiently. In some circumstances, that could be a very long period. The source material used the case of John Hinckley as an example of how complicated this can become. Hinckley was found not guilty by reason of insanity after shooting President Ronald Reagan and others in 1981, and he spent decades in psychiatric confinement before eventually being released under restrictions. The point was not that Lindsay's case is equivalent to Hinckley's. It is not. The point is that an insanity-related verdict does not necessarily mean that the legal system simply forgets what happened. There can still be years of treatment, evaluations, restrictions, and difficult decisions about whether someone is safe to return to society. And that brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all. What happens if someone appears mentally healthy years later? That is where the case becomes particularly difficult for both sides. The defense may argue that Lindsay was experiencing postpartum psychosis at the time of the killings, while the prosecution can point to the terrible consequences of what happened and argue that society still needs protection. Those two concerns can exist at the same time. The court has to examine the defendant's mental state at the relevant moment, but authorities also have to think about future safety. The source material even discusses the possibility of someone recovering from a psychotic episode and later being considered safe enough to leave psychiatric care. That possibility is disturbing to many people because the public naturally asks what would happen if the person later had another child or experienced another psychiatric crisis. Those fears can become powerful in a case involving children. But fear alone cannot answer the legal question. The jury still has to consider the evidence presented in court. And that is why jury selection and the composition of the jury could matter so much. Dr. Jordan discussed the difficulty of asking jurors to separate their emotions from the legal standard. This case involves 3 children. For many people, that fact alone creates an almost overwhelming emotional reaction. But jurors are not simply being asked whether the deaths were terrible. They already know they were. They are being asked to determine whether the prosecution has proved the necessary elements of the case and, depending on the defense, whether Lindsay met the legal standard for being considered not criminally responsible. That is a much narrower question, and it is possible for someone to feel enormous sympathy for the victims while still taking the defendant's mental state seriously. That distinction may become one of the hardest things for the jury to manage. The source discussion also compared the situation with Andrea Yates, another case involving a mother who killed her children and raised an insanity defense. The comparison is useful as legal history, but it should not be treated as proof of what will happen here. Every case has different evidence. Every jury is different. Every state's law is different. And Massachusetts has its own legal standard. That is why predictions about a verdict can be dangerous. At this stage, the evidence discussed in the source material points in several directions at once. There is the prosecution's argument that Lindsay deliberately killed her children. There is the defense's argument that she was experiencing postpartum psychosis. There is evidence about her previous mental health struggles. There are questions about her treatment. There are questions about medications. There are questions about whether healthcare providers recognized the seriousness of her condition. And there are questions about what Patrick knew and whether he could realistically have understood the danger. But there is still an important limit to what we can conclude. The fact that someone had a serious mental illness does not automatically establish that they were legally insane at the time of a crime. And the fact that someone committed a horrifying act does not automatically tell us what was happening inside that person's mind when it occurred. Those questions have to be answered through evidence. That is why blaming Patrick too quickly could actually distract from the central issue. If there is no evidence that Patrick intentionally ignored a clear and immediate danger, turning him into the central villain may not explain what happened. It may simply satisfy the human desire to find another person to hold responsible. And that desire is understandable. 3 children died. A family was destroyed. Patrick lost his children. Lindsay faces the possibility of spending the rest of her life dealing with the consequences of what happened. There is no simple ending to a story like this. The most difficult part may be accepting that several things can be true at once. Patrick may have wished he had recognized the warning signs sooner. The medical system may have failed to provide the level of care Lindsay needed. Lindsay may have suffered from severe psychiatric illness. And prosecutors may still argue that she should be held criminally responsible. The jury's job is to decide how those facts fit together under Massachusetts law. And that is why the question, murder or psychosis, cannot be answered simply by looking at the aftermath. The real question is what was happening in Lindsay's mind at the precise time she allegedly committed the killings. If the defense can establish that she lacked the substantial capacity to understand the wrongfulness of her actions, the legal consequences could be dramatically different. If prosecutors convince the jury that she understood what she was doing and acted deliberately, the outcome could be very different again. As for Patrick, the evidence discussed here does not establish that he was responsible for the deaths. The questions about what he knew, what he should have known, and whether he could have done more are understandable, but they should not be confused with proof that he caused what happened. And perhaps that is the most important distinction to remember as this case continues. We can ask whether someone could have done more without claiming that person caused the tragedy. We can take postpartum psychosis seriously without automatically accepting every part of the defense. And we can recognize the horror of what happened while still requiring the prosecution to prove its case according to the law. So where does that leave us? With a case in which the emotional facts are overwhelming, but the legal question is surprisingly specific. Was Lindsay Clancy capable of understanding the wrongfulness of her actions when the children died? That is the question the evidence must ultimately answer. And for Patrick Clancy, the question may be much simpler. Was there actual evidence that he knowingly ignored a danger he understood, or are people blaming him because they cannot accept that sometimes a terrible tragedy leaves no easy person to blame? That distinction matters, and as the court examines the psychiatric evidence, the medication history, the testimony, and the defense's explanation of what Lindsay was experiencing, those questions may become even more important. What do you think is more important in this case? The evidence about Lindsay's mental state, or the questions surrounding what Patrick knew before the tragedy? If you want to keep following this case as the court examines those questions, subscribe and stay with us for the next update.